Let's do a quick round of introductions. If you could give your name and any organization you're representing here. Go ahead.
So Tom Armstrong with BPS.
Sam Brooklyn with BPS. Daniel Sobing, BPS.
Jessica Mooring, BPS.
I'm Jeff Cottle with BPS.
Corky Collier, not with BPS. Apparently I'm on the wrong side of the table here. Hi guys, I'm Corky Collier with Columbia Corridor Association.
Julie Michelle with BPS.
Cassie Cohen with Portland Harbor Community Coalition.
Sarah Taylor, Portland Harbor Community Advisory Group and Braided River Campaign.
Rose Longoria with Yakima Nation.
Jana Jarvis, Oregon Trucking Association.
Willie Myers with the Columbia Pacific Building and Construction Trades Council.
Susie Lawson, I'm sitting in for Ellen Wax from Working Waterfront Coalition.
Heather King from the Columbia City Watershed Council.
Good morning, everyone. Patricia Diefender from Bureau of Planning and Sustainability.
And we have a few online. Bob, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Bob Salinger, Willamette Riverkeeper.
Thank you. And Benton? Are you there?
Hey, Benton Strong, Bigger and Working Waterfront Coalition.
Great, thank you. And I see Marie online.
Hi, Marie Walkowitz, Bureau of Environmental Services.
Great, thank you. I think everyone else is here. So we are going to hear some more about E-zones this morning. Then we're going to talk about some scenarios. We'll have a break. Sorry, I don't know exactly the time, but I think around 11:30ish. And then after the break, we'll break up into small groups, including people online, and then we'll have a couple of groups here and talking to maps. So first item on the agenda is E-zone basics.
Hi, Daniel Sobing, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I'm an environmental planner and I'm working on environmental overlay zones. My project is working in conjunction with the EOA, and we're collaborating together to make sure that the E-zones that we're proposing are consistent with and supported by the policies that are proposed in the EOA. And all of the changes that we're proposing as part of this project are projected to go into effect at the same time that the EOA goes into effect. Next slide, please. So this is the regulatory context for why we have E-zones, also known as environmental overlay zones. They're originally created as to protect natural resources as required by Oregon Land Use Planning Goal 5. Portland gradually adopted E-zones in different areas over a couple of decades, and the process of E-zone adoption was completed as of 2004. When Metro adopted Title 13 as part of the Regional Growth Management Functional Plan, Portland had two options. Portland either had to adopt Metro's draft code and draft maps, or we had to demonstrate that the E-zone program that we already had was in substantial compliance with Metro's code. That's what we did. We demonstrated substantial compliance, but Metro wanted the city of Portland to go further. They asked us to enter into an intergovernmental agreement, and that agreement obligated Portland to start work on updating E-zones in the Columbia Corridor and to do work on the North Reach and doing environmental protections within the North Reach of the Willamette. So we've already, as of 2013, said that we are committed to doing these things, working on the E-zone updates and working on the North Reach updates. We also, since then, have had the FEMA biological opinion. The BIOP determined that the National Flood Insurance Program as administered by FEMA is not in compliance with the Endangered Species Act, that it threatened the continued existence of salmon and steelhead. So we have to do environmental protections to protect those species. So anytime that we're updating the E-zones, we need to make sure that we are right with all three of these regulatory regimes: Goal 5, Metro Title 13, and FEMA BIOP. Any work that we do is under the jurisdiction of those regulations. So what are E-zones? E-zones are environmental overlay zones. They're part of the City of Portland zoning code. They protect important natural resources like streams, forests, and wetlands. They have limitations on the creation of new disturbance area, and they have required setbacks from important water features. So that's how the E-zones work, is by limiting development and by requiring setbacks. They come in two flavors. There's the conservation zone and the protection zone. The conservation zone is the less stringent, less restrictive of the two. Protection zone is very restrictive. Protection zone is essentially a no-build area for any private development. Conservation zone, some development can happen, and the rules and regulations that apply to the conservation zone could theoretically be adjusted through through an environmental review process. Important to point out that when we talk about disturbance area, as far as the zoning code is concerned, that's all development activities. So any clearing, grading, filling, creation of new buildings, parking lots, driveways, any of that stuff would be considered to be a disturbance area, and it would all be regulated if it was proposed to happen within the E zone. Next slide, please. So why are E zones being updated? E zones in the Columbia Corridor are relatively old. They were adopted in the late 80s, early 90s for the most part, and there really haven't been a lot of changes to the E zones in that geography since then. And since then, we have gained access to high resolution aerial imagery over a long period of time, LiDAR, we've done a lot of site visits, we have a lot of wetland delineations that have been done in the area. So we know that our mapping of these natural resources of vegetation, floodplains, wetlands and streams are not consistent with where the E zones are mapped. There are gaps between the existing E zones and where these resources are. And so the intention is that we would be doing updates to the E zone mapping to fill in those gaps. Next slide, please. So Portland has a complex system of natural resource protections. Can you highlight with your cursor the area around the Willamette Greenway? So the Willamette River has a boundary around it. There's a line that's shown there. That's the Willamette River Greenway boundary. Within that boundary, there are certain state land use planning goals that apply. Outside of that boundary, there are different land use planning goals that apply. So we treat these two geographies, the Willamette River and the rest of the city, as distinct geographies. We have already completed the application of environmental regulations to the south reach and the central reach of the Willamette, but there's a gap. The north reach has some really old environmental regulations that are really not consistent with how we do things nowadays, and so it's a thing that we need to address. And so the area that's circled in yellow on the map, that is the north reach of the Willamette, and that's something that we're going to be talking about at the next meeting of this group. So in December, we're going to focus our conversation on that area and on floodplains. Today, we're talking about the area that's circled in red on the map up there. That's the Columbia Corridor, the Columbia Slough watershed. That's the area where my project is working on updating environmental overlay zones.
If I can interrupt a little bit.
Oh, yeah, please.
It looks like there's a little bit of orange kind of south of the Swan Island area. Is that also part of CCIL or is that?
Yeah, there's a couple of isolated industrial geographies. So we did an environmental overlay zone project that was adopted last year. And when we were doing the planning for that project, we excluded basically all the industrial areas. So there's that little piece of orange there. We've also done the Johnson Creek watershed.
Okay, just wanted to clarify. Thanks.
Yeah, and a couple other isolated pieces. Okay, so what kinds of resources are located in the project area? We're talking about the Columbia Slough, which is a dredged, channelized, water-controlled area. It's been highly regulated, highly constrained. It's an area where industrial development is built right up at the edge of these natural resource features. It's in many ways heavily degraded and polluted and impacted. But if you look at the history of the Columbia Corridor in this area, this was a braided river channel. The Columbia Slough was a vibrant, dynamic habitat resource that was used by indigenous people for thousands of years. It was used by all kinds of wildlife. It's been largely, what's left is just little remnants and pockets of the existing resource that are heavily impacted. But it's really, really important to note that all of these features, as degraded as they may be, provide important habitat or contribute ecosystem services that support threatened, endangered, or critically species that are locally considered to be critical. So it's an important resource. And in addition to these habitat services that it's providing to wildlife, it's also mitigating heat island effect, retaining stormwater, preventing the flow of pollutants into these important water features. So these are resources that I think it's unquestionable are worthy of some level of protection. I think the only question is, what is the appropriate level of protection and how do we balance those protections with the need for industrial land capacity? So now it's time for discussion. I've got a few prompting questions here, but feel free to ask anything if you have any thoughts so far.
I'll have a question.
Yeah.
So can you put an E-zone? E-zones aren't just for empty land. They could be an E-zone, could be where there already is some building or some, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's very common that we'll have if there's a feature that's next to a developed site, that there will be a E-zone buffer that will extend onto that site and could, in some cases, cover buildings, parking lots, driveways. That's not at all uncommon. Yeah.
Daniel, you said that back several years ago, Metro asked the city to go further in the Columbia corridor. Can you kind of elaborate on that? Why did they ask that?
So Metro Title 13 is the nature neighborhoods. And Portland had to demonstrate that we were in substantial compliance with nature neighborhoods. And we produced a big, thick document that said we have this E-zone program, but we also have all these other natural resource protection programs. We have drainage way reserve regulations, we have stormwater regulations, we have floodplain regulations, building codes, all kinds of things. And Metro said that the E-zones alone are not enough to meet Title 13, but taken on the whole, all of Portland's environmental protections altogether are enough to meet Title 13 requirements. But Metro wanted the E-zones to be something that was fully compliant with Title 13. And it said to do that, you need to update your maps, you need to update your regulations, you need to more robust E-zones. So the IGA that Portland signed with Metro said that it didn't constrain us to any specific policy or any specific will undertake the remapping of E-zones to the Columbia corridor, and left it at that. So that's where we're at, is we're obligated to do some kind of project to do something, but we don't have our hands tied in terms of how those protections need to look.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So to be clear, you're supposed to update maps, make sure everything's current, not necessarily supposed to expand E-zones, for example, but that we are supposed to. So, and that fits in with what you're saying about, we have LiDAR available now, for example. So we want to go back in and check the maps, which we talked last year, I think. You're saying, hey, in some cases, you're going to have some of the E-zones pulled back, So if we're not necessarily at this stage expanding the E-zones per se, but we're trying to improve our maps, then one would think that on average, there would be no increase in the E-zones under the current, but that's not what I see in the reports. So can you explain why we're seeing, saying, well, we need, under current guidelines, we need to have an increase in E-zones?
Yes, so there's one aspect is that we know that there are gaps between the existing E-zones and the natural resources. So we know that there's approximately 150 acres of wetlands that are completely outside of E-zones right now, and there are some distance of slough channels that are completely outside of E-zones right now as well. So if we were to apply existing policy as it applies to these features without making any other changes to the maps, there would be some expansion to pick up those additional features. So that would be several hundred acres of additional E-zones just to cover those features.
So you're saying there was wetlands, for example, that we knew about before, but we did not include?
Knew about or didn't know about. We have, so I mean, the way that we're putting together our wetland inventory, we're working with our colleagues at BES. They get wetland delineation reports from the Department of State Lands, and they do their own work in the field to identify wetlands. And so we have an old wetland inventory that was highly incomplete, was based mostly on the federal wetland inventory. We have a new wetland inventory that's based on more updated data that has been updated in the last 30 years since the easements were first applied. So we have, and it may be that some of those wetlands were known about and they just said, let's ignore those, or it may be that they were just unknown wetlands that were out there in the field that we just discovered recently. So we do know is that there are features that were missed by the existing E-zones based on our current understanding of where the resources are. So, and that's why, and so we'll get into the different scenarios that we have shortly, but in our lowest scenario, the minimum compliance scenario, the attempt is to keep E-zones consistent with existing mapping and to really just expand to cover those features that were missed and to do it in a way that's consistent with the rules and regulations that we now understand. So Goal 5, Title 13, and the FEMA buyout.
I think it's important to define what you mean by expanding, because there's sort of two moving parts here. One is the accuracy of the mapping, and that changes the E-zone both. In some areas it expands and in some areas it contracts because we have better technology, we have better information. We've actually gone out on site where property owners have allowed us to actually be more accurate. So the E-zone is moving in both directions there. Then the second is a policy decision, which is mainly around the scenarios, which is, and that can lead to an expansion as a policy decision.
And thank you. That's a good clarification of it right there. And I guess my question had to do with the first part, which just objectively speaking, if we're improving maps, then on average, there should be no change in the zones, but we're seeing significant increase. So that's what I'm trying to get my hands around is why is that? You know, did we mess up before? What
I don't know if it was mess up. We just didn't have as, you know, we had old this is what, 1990s aerial photo technology, probably not as much in terms of field work kind of thing. We have much better aerial photo LiDAR to locate the stuff on the ground. We put much more labor into actually going out on site to be more accurate.
So would it be fair to say, for example, maybe there was a small wetlands that we just missed before,
yes,
but now we're being more accurate. So we're digging a bit deeper.
Yes.
Maybe I shouldn't say that. But is that
yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
All right.
And within the E-zones, there's always been an opportunity for property owners to go through what we call a map correction process, for them to hire their own consultants to get more accurate maps to say, here's where the resources really are and where the E-zone should be. It's just that through this process, we've taken on more of that burden to get a more accurate depiction of where that line should be.
So I have a question, because I'm not quite
Hang on, Bob. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So does having a wetland that was not previously within an E-zone, having it now within an E-zone, does it afford it any additional protections, or is it just an administrative sort of process of getting that wetland within an E-zone?
Currently, environmental rights, so the state of Oregon has some wetland protections, but they're not that stringent. So basically, there's a removal fill regulation. It says that if you're going to do development in an area where there are likely to be wetlands, you need to go out there and do a delineation and verify that there aren't wetlands. If you find a wetland when you're going through that process, then you can apply to fill that wetland, and the state is pretty permissive about that. If you go for a removal fill permit, the state will usually say, go ahead and fill it, just build a mitigation wetland somewhere else to replace the lost function. Mitigation wetlands rarely actually replace those functions. They may replace some of the stormwater retention, but they're not going to replace the habitat functions, at least not in the short term.
Right.
So that's the current regulations if there's a wetland that we have not identified. Once we put an E-zone on it, if we put an E-zone on it, then that would mean that any new development that happens on that site typically will be required to be set back. And if they can't set it back, then there will be some mitigation requirements that will be much more stringent than what the state would require.
Okay.
Have you applied wetland protection? Have you applied the E-zones to the wetlands that you now know are in them?
Yeah, so all of the scenarios we're proposing would at a minimum apply E-zones to all of the wetlands that are identified.
Are any of them P-zones or they're all E-zones?
We'll get into that
A
in a
lot of
second.
those questions are going to be answered, yeah.
So Bob has his hand up and I want to be able to get to his question. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, thank you. I think two questions. One, can you tell us a little bit more about the airport futures process, where there was some expansion, but also some things put off until we could get to the EOA? That process was a long time ago. I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit more about the nexus with that. And then if you can also talk a little bit more about the FEMA floodplains BIOP and what you think you need to do to comply with that.
Yeah, so the airport futures plan was adopted right before Metro Title 13 went into effect. It had specific recommendations to apply 50-foot protection zone buffers around all wetlands and around all streams and sloughs. So 50-foot minimum buffers around all those features. That was a recommendation that was made for the entire project area around the middle Columbia area, so the middle portion of the slough. And the recommendation was adopted for part of the project area, but not the entire project area. And the reason for that was we didn't have a current EOA at the time, so we didn't have the ability to really constrain industrial lands without risking a appeal and overturn of that project. So the recommendations were adopted strictly for the sites that are owned by the Port of Portland. So all the recommendations, if it was a site that was an industrial site that was owned by the Port of Portland, those recommendations were applied. If it was a site that didn't have industrial zoning, it was residential or open space, the recommendations were applied, but we didn't touch privately owned industrial sites in that project.
If I can just add one thing to that before you get to the FEMA floodplains, I was on that. It was a 3-year long process. And I think it's worth noting that it was a unanimous recommendation that came out of that. I know that because I was the last holdout, but it was a cast of like 30 or 40 stakeholders. It was a huge monster process. So I think it's just worth noting that this recommendation went through a pretty mammoth review.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And then the other point that you have, the FEMA BIOP. So as we interpret the regulations that are applied there are regulations that apply to the building code, and that's going to be handled separately. That is something that we want to consider as part of the EOA process. But the building code aspect is not part of this discussion because we're talking strictly zoning code here. But in terms of the BIOP, there would be restrictions on new development in the floodplain. Any fill that would be put in the floodplain, including buildings, would have to be mitigated by excavations to compensate for that fill. And then the other thing is there would be natural resource protections that would apply within 170 feet of the bank of any stream or the ordinary high water of any of the rivers. And so all of the recommendations that we're making today or that we're discussing today would fully address the natural resource protection aspects of the BIOP. So there would be a 170-foot buffer around all streams and sloughs. Where that buffer intersects with the floodplain, we would be proposing to apply C-zone there. So that would, is our interpretation, fully comply with the FEMA BIOP.
And I'm sorry, but that applies to areas outside of the drainage districts.
That's correct. So
Okay,
only areas outside the levees. If it's levee protected, then we interpret the BIOP.
It's a different floodplain, yeah.
Any other questions or comments before we move on?
I guess I just want to say that, we want to keep putting human health and people, center this conversation on human health. And I was a school principal and a midwife, and we know that the teachers are striking right now. And what I know is that air pollution causes learning disabilities, and we've all read the research, and we know that. And so for a teacher to have more than 23 in her room, if they don't have learning disabilities, it is easier to have more than 23. It's easier to have less planning time. So I just want you to know that I want us to all keep the teachers in mind and what our decisions do to the children in Portland. And we know how I came into this conversation is by looking at the data around children, because I've been doing some work in Haiti, and the children around the slough and in North Portland have much higher rates of special education when compared to other areas in the city of the same income. So I want us to keep centering on that people lived along the slough, and any of us who have driven know maybe their houses were rezoned so that they could no longer live there, but then that just created generational poverty. So all of these are things that impact the classroom. So as our teachers are out on the street, I just want people to remember that our decisions around the environment impact the classroom.
Thanks, Sarah. All right. Are we ready for the next chapter?
Next chapter. So let's start talking about the proposed changes to the E-zones. We've been kind of dancing around it. Let's get in more detail about what these proposals actually look like. So before I explain the scenarios, I want to talk about how we map natural resources in the city of Portland. We have an adopted natural resource inventory, which maps vegetation, streams, sloughs, and wetlands. When it was created, it was intended to be consistent with state land use planning goals, Metro Title 13, and Metro Title 13 requirements for natural resource protections. The NRI has a system for determining the relative values of riparian resources and wildlife habitat. And that's what we use to determine where the E-zones should be applied. And the NRI also includes an inventory of special habitat areas that provide habitat for threatened, endangered, and locally significant species. NRI has a complicated model. but it produces really consistent outputs. So we can say with certainty that high rankings are applied to all wetlands, no matter where they fall, to all forested areas that intersect with streams, sloughs, and wetlands, and that extends out to 50 feet. So that's what our high riparian resource ranking is. High structure canopy vegetation within 50 feet of water features and all wetlands. The medium ranking applies to all land within 50 feet of water features. So that's even if it's not vegetated, the medium ranking extends out at least 50 feet. That could include buildings, graveled areas, parking lots, whatever. It also includes vegetation that extends beyond 50 feet. So low structure vegetation, shrubbery, and herbaceous vegetation out to 100 feet. If it's forested, that medium ranking would extend out to 200 feet. So if it's a forested area, you could have a 200-foot buffer around all of your water features that would be at least a medium ranking. The low ranking is applied to vegetation that's more than 200 feet away and to all portions of the floodplain, whether it's developed or undeveloped. Next slide. So E-zones are typically applied directly to the natural resource features and to these riparian rankings. And the E-zones usually include a buffer that goes around those features. And the buffers are there to provide a setback so that when new development goes in, the impacts to these natural resources are kept away from the resources and you don't lose the resources to development. And so when we're crafting these E-zone scenarios, we have two ways that we can vary the protection that we apply to these resources. One is we choose whether we want to apply a C-zone or a P-zone. By varying the type of E-zone that we apply, we're varying the stridency of the E-zone. The other thing is by varying the size of the buffer. The larger the buffer, the more protection, the smaller the buffer, the less protection. So we have three different scenarios, and they're each tweaking those two different dials. The buffers can be standard or decrease, and in some cases we're applying P-zone, in some cases we're applying C-zone. So and hopefully through the application of these different buffer sizes and P-zone types, we're getting some scenarios that encompass a range of different options. So we have three different scenarios for how the E-zones should be applied within the project area. The first is the minimum compliance scenario, which would apply E-zones to all identified streams, sloughs, and wetlands. It would fill all the known gaps that currently exist in the E-zones, and it would ensure that E-zones are applied to all water features that meet what we consider to be the minimum regulatory requirements of federal, state, and regional governments. The minimum compliance scenario is not intended to be the best possible environmental protection, but it should check all of the boxes for minimum natural resource protection requirements. The climate resilience scenario is more protective. It builds on the minimum scenario by applying E-zones over a broader area, ensuring that new development has mandatory setbacks. And then the maximum scenario would cover slightly more area than the climate resilience scenario, and it would have larger mandatory setbacks. Okay, so let's look a little bit more detail. I'm going to move quickly over these slides. We can come back and talk about this in more detail, but I just want to kind of brush over the surface level here. So in the minimum compliance scenario, P-zone is applied to all streams, all sloughs, and most wetlands. The only time it's not applying to wetlands is wetlands that are either not in the floodplain or are far away from a water feature. There would also be a C-zone that would apply to all of those high-ranking resources. Remember, high-ranking resources are all the wetlands and land, and it's all of the forested land within 50 feet of water features. And then we have rules that apply to the special habitat areas. Those rules are uniform across all the scenarios, so they don't change from one to the next. The reason that they don't change is because they're intended to be consistent with existing application of E-zones within those special habitat areas. We have a Metro Title 13 says we can't roll back E-zones from current coverage, and so the application of E-zones to these special habitat areas is covering us on that no rollback provision. Next slide. The climate resilience scenario builds on that minimum scenario. It still protects all of the high-ranking features, but now it's also protecting the medium-ranking riparian features. It's applying P-zone to all of those water features now. So the wetlands in the minimum scenario, we're not getting P-zone, would get P-zone in this scenario, and there would be a 25-foot P-zone buffer around all water features now. So that means that with a 25-foot buffer, that means that there's a mandatory 25-foot setback from those water features that can't be adjusted under any circumstances. So that's the main difference is that 25-foot setback that this would impose. The maximum resource protection scenario, very similar to the climate resilient scenario, covers a few more resources, some forest vegetation that's a little further away from the water. But the main difference here is that the buffers around those features, the protection zone buffers, are now going out to 50 feet. That's consistent with what we saw in the airport futures plan. So the recommendations of that plan would be more or less what you're seeing right here. So that's the maximum resource protection scenario. So next slide. So again, these are our 3 scenarios. And we're coming up on another discussion break really soon. So if you have questions, we will be just about ready for those. But I want to start digging into the statistics a little bit before we get to that next break. So I want to look at how these E-zones are covering the features that we have mapped here. So this first slide, we're looking at just the high-ranking riparian resources. So again, this is the wetlands, this is the forest vegetation near the streams. You can see on the left that the existing E-zones have a gap. They're covering almost all of those high-ranking resources, but there's about 400 acres that are totally missed right now by the existing E-zones. So all 3 scenarios would fill that gap. So now we're covering 100% of those high-ranking resources. The only real difference when we're talking about the high-ranking resources is how much P-zone is applied, and that's because the P-zone buffers are different in these different scenarios. So there's about a 300-acre difference between the high scenario and the low scenario for these high-ranking resources. So next slide. These are the medium-ranking resources. I want to call your attention to the scale bar here. This is a much smaller amount of resources than in the high. The high we were talking about 6,000 plus acres. This is about 1,100 acres of medium resources. That's because the medium rankings are typically kind of a band that goes around these high-ranking resources. So it's less area, but again, there's a gap. The existing E-zones are missing about 500 acres of these medium-value riparian resources. The minimum compliance scenario, as far as the medium-ranking resources are concerned, would be basically identical to the existing E-zones. The same gap would exist there with the minimum compliance scenario, but the climate resilient scenario and the maximum resource protection scenario would both fill that gap and fully cover all of those medium value resources. Again, different amounts of P-zone between the the maximum scenario and the climate resilient scenario because the buffer sizes are different. And then finally, we have the low-ranking resources. Again, this is the entire floodplain, including portions of the floodplain that are fully developed outside of the levee, entire non-levee protected floodplain, sorry. And then vegetation that's more than 200 feet away from the water features. So these are resources that have some value, but it's more like a speculative value. If it was allowed to return to high structure canopy vegetation in the long run, then these would be more valuable. But right now, they're really not contributing a lot of resources. So none of our scenarios are covering all of these. Yes, question?
Just have a clarifying question. Those
Yeah.
3 scenarios you keep referencing,
Yeah.
are they exclusive? Like you're going to have to only choose one of those scenarios to move forward, or can you move forward with all of those scenarios combined?
That's a good question. Yeah. We could theoretically mix and match and take
and is
elements
that
from different
the
scenarios.
goal? Is that I mean, it sounds to me that would be optimal, at least from my perspective anyway, but is that a high probability that the city's going to be able to combine all those?
It's a good question. I don't know how that process is going to play out. What we want to do right now is kind of have some concrete examples of this is the full range, and these are kind of illustrative of what that range could be. But I think it's possible that we could do some blending and mixing.
And why those 3 different scenarios? Like, how did you decide to display those, and what's the decision-making process?
The third scenario was really pinned to what was done in that Middle Columbia Airport Futures Plan. We looked at that as being like the Cadillac gold standard of what we can do with natural resource protection. So we thought if we were going to apply that plan throughout the entire project area, this is what it would look like. And then the minimum scenario, we were looking at the regulatory regime that we find ourselves in with Metro and state regulations and FEMA buyout. And we said, if we were just going to do what we were being told by the regulators we absolutely have to do, this is the way we would do it. So, and then the middle one is kind of the midway point between those 2.
I think what we're trying to do is give a range of options that we can talk about. And you'll see in subsequent slides, each of these scenarios, further analysis is done to see exactly what the impact of each of these scenarios are on the industrial land and more specifically even the industrial land that's identified within the buildable lands inventory. So this is all information for us to begin to evaluate and think about, okay, how do we balance the protection of industrial or the preservation of industrial land and the natural resources.
Hang on 1 second, Heather. I see Bob has his hand up and then I'll come back to you. Are you ready for discussion?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, just for the record, I'm not sure that the minimum actually does meet all the regulatory standards that are out there. But that aside, I put something in the comments and Tom responded, but I want to return to it, which is trees. Yeah, tree code has not been applied to industrial lands because of a lack of EOA. And so it concerns me that trees are not sort of incorporated in here, because the argument against applying the tree code was trees might take up some of the land use opportunities for industrial development. Therefore, for over a decade, we haven't applied that to industrial lands, and at least to some industrial lands. And so I just wanted to check in on that, because it seems like these options need to also include the potential for applying the tree code and what kind of impacts that would have as well.
Yeah, so first of all, again, please be clear about what you mean by industrial lands. The tree code actually applies to the IG zones and the EG zones. It currently does not apply to the IH zone, the heavy industrial zone. And we made that change a few years ago, partly due to the EOA industrial land impacts. We did apply it to the IG and EG zones. When it comes to trees and E zones, what Daniel's project has done is look at trees that sort of are close to the wetlands and the riparian areas that have essentially greater natural resource value, and that they get essentially protected or regulated by the E-zone itself. The tree code mainly applies to more isolated trees that are outside of those natural resource areas. And so it's almost two different regulatory schemes, and that what we're talking about right now are those larger clusters of trees that have more significant natural resource value, and whether or not those should be protected, or how they get protected by what kind of E-zone. In January, we'll bring back as another policy option tree protections and tree code application to the heavy industrial zone. And we'll bring in staff from the urban forestry program to talk about what those options might be.
Okay, that's great. That's what I was looking for at the end. I agree with you. It was not, as I said, to some industrial lands. It was not applied to, I think, all industrial lands originally, but we added some in a few years ago, as you know. But that's what I was looking for, was to see that it would be coming in at some point. Thanks.
I'm curious how your application of E-zones in the industrial zone and the slough watershed in particular compared to how they were applied in the city of Portland when you redid the E-zones there, and if it's the same or if it's different.
That's a good point. Can you go to slide 33? Yeah, so the environmental overlay zone map correction project was just adopted last year, went into effect in October. We had a minimum application of protection overlay zone to all streams and all wetlands that were identified in that project area. And there was a minimum buffer of at least 25 feet of protection zone around all those features. So in some sites, didn't come quite to the point where the Middle Columbia recommendations were. But at least half of the project area, we were putting at least 50-foot P-zone buffers around all of those features. So about half of that project area would be consistent with the maximum scenario. About half of that project area would be consistent with the climate resilience scenario. So it kind of straddled those two different scenarios.
So is it similar to the way it was implemented in the city, like other areas in the city that are more residential, or?
Yeah. So this applied to the residential, basically all of Portland that has E-zones that is not industrial, and those two scenarios would fall within the range of what we did in the maximum resource protection scenario. With the 50-foot buffers would be kind of the highest protection that we did in this project, and then the climate resilience scenario would be kind of the minimum that we did in that project. So our minimum compliance scenario, the lowest one that we have here, was outside of the range of what we did with that project. That was not something that we would have considered in that project.
And did you look at, when you were doing these, where people live in the industrial areas? And
yeah, we actually did preliminary planning for this project while we were doing that project. Initially, we were going to do the whole city. But when we realized that the EOA was coming up, we wanted to exclude the industrial areas from the EOA to allow this to happen concurrently. So we did initial planning and we looked at industrial sites and residential sites, and we came up with some recommendations based on the different land uses in industrial and residential areas.
Okay. I guess my point is there are people that live in the industrial area.
Totally, yes, yeah. And so we looked at Columbia Corridor as being a big geography that was mostly industrial, but we recognized that there are a number of residential enclaves within the Columbia Corridor. And we actually did like 36 site visits in those residential areas that are within the Columbia Corridor while this project was ongoing and before we made that decision to exclude it. So we're definitely considering it, and I appreciate that you point to that fact that there are people living there, and there actually are some places that are currently zoned residential that currently have houses on them that are zoned industrial in the future. They have comp plan designations that would allow them to be rezoned for future industrial uses. So there's a thought that some portions of the Columbia Corridor will become more industrialized as development happens in the future. There's some other areas that are staying residential and will not change.
Heather, are you asking, within these scenarios, did we treat the residential areas different from the industrial areas?
That's part of my question.
Yeah.
And we're not treating them differently. At least currently, the proposals that we have right now are uniform regardless of the base zone. We're applying the same E-zones to all zones regardless of the base zone use.
Is it also safe to say, Daniel, that the slide where you show the sort of the parameters, those parameters are consistent parameters. It's the methodology that was developed for the E-zone project, and that methodology is being applied here.
I guess my issue would be that if there's a residential area in the industrial zone, you're treating the E-zones there like the same way that you're, like that.
Currently, yeah. And that's something that we could change. You know, currently we wanted to have just a clean, uniform, these are the three scenarios, but we could pick and choose as we go forward. We could say in industrial zones, we think that the maximum protection scenarios makes sense. And in residential zones, we think that the minimum scenario makes sense. And we could mix and match for different areas, which is what we did with the E-zone project. We really were, and the difference with the E-zone project was we built it as being a map correction project. We said that we are going to look at the existing E-zones the way that they're applied today, and we're not going to really change them at all. So if they had big P-zone buffers in one part of the city before, they're going to still have big P-zone buffers going forward. And if they had small P-zone buffers before, we're going to keep them small there. And so we tried to stay as true as possible to the existing E-zones, with the exception that we uniformly applied P-zone to all water features, which was a change from the previous E-zones. That was the only real change. Everything else was supposed to be consistent with the existing E-zones.
Sarah.
I just want to say that zoning residential, low-income residential housing in industrial areas, probably the city, from my calculation, has probably lost 20,000 affordable homes since, in the last few decades. So I don't think that we should be destroying the economic worth of people's homes in areas that have been rezoned industrial. These are our affordable housing, and anyone who's really dug deep into what's happened to the people along the Willamette River and along the slough in the Columbia River know that it's discriminatory zoning towards people that were low income living in those areas. So I just want to really make it clear that I don't support having a housing crisis and taxing people at the same time that we're kicking low-income people. Essentially, you're kicking low-income people out of their homes over time. If you've never walked with me in Linton, take a walk with me in Linton, and I will show you how you have done that. So I just don't support that. Until we're done with our housing crisis, I don't think any house should be dezoned. That they have no worth in their home. They have lost their economic ability. And these are people who are often immigrants who have been here for decades. So.
Yeah, to clarify that point, like regarding E-zones or base zones, are you saying that you think that we shouldn't be applying environmental protections on sites that are residential, that are enclaves?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying as long as we're having a housing crisis, no residential property should be zoned industrial.
So the
Those people should be allowed to live out their life like anybody else can live out their life. I don't think a house should be zoned industrial. It's basically redlining people who are living along our waterways, to me.
In this process, we're not proposing to change the base zoning.
Well, he just said some of the houses will become,
Historically, that has been done. So when the comprehensive plan was adopted several years ago, there are a few places in the Columbia corridor where that has already been done, to clarify that we didn't change the base zones. What we did was we changed the comp plan designation. So if somebody was to buy up the sites and then put them together and do a comp plan amendment, they could, basically a zoning confirmation to rezone them to an industrial use. They could do that, but we're not currently proposing to do that to any residential sites here.
There's a difference between the comp plan designation and the zoning, right? I think that this is what Daniel's just trying to explain, just for everybody's. So the comp, in some places, apparently, in the comp plan update, areas that have housing and have residential zoning, but are probably nestled in, and the characteristic, they're have a lot of proximity to industrial uses and industrial land. That has already been done. A comprehensive plan designation of industrial has been put on some of those areas. It doesn't mean that we will actively change, or those houses can't remain there. It does mean, however, that somebody conceivably could ask for a zone change to be consistent with that comprehensive plan designation. But I don't think we have any plans to actively do that beyond the change that was made with the comp plan. Does that make sense?
it does. I don't feel good about it. No, my understanding is that if they go to sell, they get older, that they can't sell it as a home. As long as their family lives there, they can keep living in their home. But as soon as they go to sell that home, or a lot of them they end up not being able to take care of their homes, and then they're taken away from them. So that's been my experience. So I know what exists. I just want to be clear that I'm going to speak up for the people who I feel were harmed by this process, because I think it's the poorest of the poor in our city. So I just want to speak for them.
I saw Corky had his hand up.
Yeah, I think, and Sarah, I don't mean to speak for you, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what I hear you saying, and I think it's a really good point, is let's be careful about the unintended consequences. You're pointing out to homeowners, for example, in the area, should some of the environmental zone overlays be applied to some residential areas, it makes it harder they can no longer improve their house, where that line, whether it's over into a P zone, for example. And it can create a difficulty that we don't want to burden these homeowners with. I think that's what you're saying, right? No? Okay.
No, I'm not saying that in any way. I know a lot of these people, not as much on the slough as on the Willamette River, and the least of their concerns is that they're not allowed to fix up their home. That is not their concern. Their concern is that they can't afford to fix up their home because everything around them is now industrial, and they can't sell their home, and that these communities have been destroyed. I'm just saying, in a housing crisis, you don't have a housing crisis and then zone houses industrial. That's what I'm saying. Is that either have a housing crisis or don't have a housing crisis. But in the midst of a housing crisis, you don't turn tens of thousands of homes over decades into industrial lands.
Yeah, right.
That's all I'm saying.
Did I see another hand up over here? Are we ready to move on? We're ready. All right. Next up. So
the kind of the elephant in the room that we've had so far, we've been talking about natural resource protections, but it's really about what are the impacts to industrial lands. I think a lot of people here are really interested to see what those numbers look like. So let's start digging into that. So the project area itself is about 15,769 acres. That includes a lot of land that's not industrial. So there's some open space land there. There's some open water. There's some residential areas. But of that project area, there are 6,961 acres of tax lots that are zoned industrial. And it's important to point out tax lots because when we're talking about this, we're not really talking about the right of way. And a lot of the slough itself is actually outside of tax lots. So we really want to know the lot itself and not what the impacts are on that, on the slough channel that falls outside of it. So all the statistics we're looking at sites that have industrial zoning or mixed employment zoning, or industrial comp plan designation or employment comp plan designation, and we're looking at the tax lot area itself. So that includes IH zoning, IG1, IG2, EG1, EG2. Next slide, please. So we have the different scenarios and we have the existing E-zones. This is the coverage of those sites that are zoned industrial. And so I said previously 6,961 acres. Existing E-zones are covering about 1,120 acres of that area already. So that's about 16% of the industrial tax lots are covered by the existing E-zones. If we went with that minimum scenario, the minimum compliance scenario, that 16% coverage would go up to 18% coverage. So it would be a 2% increase in the amount of industrial tax lots that are covered by E-zones. However, there'd be a shift from the existing protection zone of 394 acres to 637 acres. So that's probably the more impactful part of this change would be the increase in protection overlay zone on industrial sites. And then the other scenarios would increase from there. So you go from 16 to 18, from 18 to 22, and then the maximum resource protection scenario would be 23% of all industrial lands would be covered by E-zones. Now, another point to point out here, actually, let's move to the next slide, is that that previous slide, we're looking at all industrial sites, not just the vacant sites, not just the underutilized sites, not just the sites that are in the BLI that we know or we think are going to redevelop over the next 20 years. So when we get into this conversation and what we're worried about is what sites are really sensitive to these changes to the E-zones, it's those BLI sites. So we have 6,961 acres of E-zones. Of that, in the BLI, there's 1,680 acres that are sites that are thought to be developable economically based on the methodology the BLI uses. BLI also has constraints. So you start with that gross acreage of 1,680 acres, but those sites are constrained in various different ways. So that actually comes down to 1,044 acres of developable land within the BLI. And 78% of that developable industrial land that's noted in the BLI is in the project area. There are some industrial areas outside of the project area, but there's very little BLI land outside the project area. So in terms of where the industrial growth is projected to happen in the future, it's really in the area that's covered by this project. So let's look at what the impacts are on these industrial sites. So before we look at the BLI itself, I want to talk about the constraints. So BLI factors in a whole bunch of different constraints. There's environmental cleanup sites, floodplains, transportation infrastructure deficiencies, sewer deficiencies, water deficiencies, all kinds of things get factored into it, and they all act as constraints. So we start with that gross 1,680 acres, and we filter it down after the constraints are taken into account. One of those constraints that's factored into it is the conservation overlay zone. If a conservation zone is applied to a site, it's only considered to be a constraint if the coverage exceeds 33% of that site. So if it's a 10-acre site, it's got to be at least 3 acres, and then the site is constrained by the C-zone. If it doesn't have at least 3 acres of coverage, then that 10-acre site is considered unconstrained, even though there's some C-zone on it. So these are sites, and this is not just looking at BLI sites, these are all the industrial sites, and there are 2,451 of them, of individual industrial tax lots in the project area. Under current zoning, 381 of them are constrained by the C-zone. So all of our scenarios, we're seeing less C-zone constraints. So you'd look at that and think, oh, we're constraining fewer sites, but remember, we're applying more P-zone and less C-zone in each of these scenarios. So you'd expect that C-zone constraint to go down because the P-zone constraint was going up. So can we see the next slide? This is the P-zone constraint, so it's doing the opposite thing. So C-zone was going down, P-zone is going up. So there are more sites that are constrained by P-zone. So it's really important to point out the C-zone constraint results in 50% reduction of the site area development. So if it's a 10-acre site and at least a third of it is covered by C-zone, the BLI says that now that site only contributes 5 acres to our development capacity. If it's a P-zone and it's at least 30% coverage or 33% coverage, the BLI now says that it has 0 development capacity at all. So as soon as 1/3 of the site is covered, the BLI excludes it and just subtracts all the site area from the BLI calculations. So these sites, as you see this increase, that's 404 sites now in the maximum resource scenario that are completely excluded from the BLI. But remember, there's multiple constraints in all of these sites. So some of these sites might have had 0% development capacity already for some other reason, or might have been greatly reduced. So we're not going to see This number doesn't translate to a straight one-to-one loss in BLI, and the only way you can really figure that out is by actually running the BLI and seeing how the impacts play out, because there's so many interconnected factors that are going into it. So next slide.
Could I-
Yes.
That's good. If it were 25 to 30% of P zone, would it be removed from the developable lands at that amount?
No,
25%?
BLI doesn't even look at it as a constraint until it hits 33%. The BLI is intended to be something that's averaged out over the whole city and makes sense over the whole city. If you're looking at an individual site, it doesn't necessarily make sense for that site. But it's a shorthand that we have to do because it's a really complicated model and it takes a lot of computing power to do it. And so it's way easier to just have these cutoffs of you get to this point and then it's 0, or you get to this point and then it's 50%, than trying to look at the individual dynamics that apply to that individual site. And so we know that some sites are going to be included in the BLI that probably couldn't be developed, and some will be excluded from the BLI that probably could be developed. But on the aggregate, when you average it out over the whole city, we think it's a methodology that makes sense for something at the scale of the city of Portland. Next slide. So first, I want to point out that this is not an apples to apples comparison, because C zone is a 50% constraint, P zone is 100% constraint, but this is looking at sites that have either a C or a P zone, because some sites have both, and some sites that had C zone previously will now have P zone. So this is just looking at how are the total number of sites that have one of these E zone constraints changing, and it's actually declining in that minimum compliance scenario, which is interesting. But as I said, this impact, to actually figure out what the actual impact is, you really have to run the BLI to do it. And that's what we did. So we ran the BLI 4 different times using the different E-zone scenarios as inputs. We kept all the other constraints the same, kept all the other factors the same, and all we did was we changed the C-zone constraint and the P-zone constraint to reflect those different scenarios to see how the actual gross acres of developable land would change in those different scenarios. We do the next slide. So this is what we see. So on the far left, that's the existing scenario that's present today. There's 1,044 acres of developable land in the city of Portland for industrial uses. If we went with the minimum compliance scenario, we would see a 5% reduction in overall BLI industrial land. So 56 acres of that gross number would go away or become undevelopable as we calculate it in the BLI. Climate resilient scenario, we're doubling that. It's now 170 acres, or 10% of the total industrial land capacity for development would go away. And then in the maximum resource protection scenario, we'd see a 14% reduction, or 149 acres. So questions, discussion?
Yeah. Questions about the scenarios, Courtney?
Yeah, just kind of as reference, 16% of the CCIL is covered by E zones of some sort.
Yeah,
I believe that's correct.
Of the industrial.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What's the rest of the city like? I mean, just as kind of, I'm trying to get my hands around this, what's, Laurelhurst like, what's downtown? Well, downtown would be very different, but I mean, overall for the city, what kind of coverage are we talking about?
It's interesting. So there are vast swaths of the city that have no E-zones at all. And that's an interesting thing to look at if you look at the citywide map of the E-zones. So the whole city of Portland used to be covered by natural resources at one point. There were streams that ran through East Portland and forests that covered everything, and a lot of that got cleared. A lot of those streams are buried now, so we have streams running underground. So there's a whole big vast geography in East Portland where there are no E-zones at all because all the resources are completely stripped and removed away. And so probably half the city has 0 E-zones. But if you confine that discussion to areas where the E-zones are actually mapped, so the West Hills, the southern tier of the city, Johnson Creek, I would say most of those areas have more than 16%. I can't give you a number off the top of my head, but I would say that the average E-zone coverage, especially in the West Hills of Portland, is much higher than it would be in any of these scenarios. Because in those areas, the E-zones extend onto forest canopy, and a lot of those areas are really
steep terrain.
And steep terrain, yes. So forest on steep terrain. And so a lot of those areas are heavily E-zoned, 60, 70, 80% of a.
But those are not that's not buildable land.
Yeah. So a lot of those, we have, that includes Forest Park, right? Yeah, it's Forest Park where they wanted to build on it. They couldn't because it was all landslide hazard area. So they
did try that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Didn't work very well.
Yeah.
That's Forest Park.
Yeah. So a lot of these on areas are areas that are totally not buildable. Columbia Corridor is flat. There are some landslide hazards that are mapped in that. There are some other hazards that are mapped there. But in terms of the objective hazards that would constrain development. We're mostly just talking about slough and water features. There's not really a lot of landslide hazard there. And so in those flatter areas of Portland, we don't typically have E-zones because we buried the streams, which we did not do in the Columbia corridor.
Right. And I guess that's sort of where I'm trying to go with this. Maybe don't mean to jump ahead here, but what's running around in my head is in the Columbia corridor, we have roughly a third of the Columbia corridor is open space or natural resource space. Some of that's golf courses, so it's not exactly natural resources, but it's open space. That's kind of proud of that. It's like, well, this is kind of cool. We've got a lot of open space here, and so to increase that even more, you kind of go, what's my goal here? Since I already have more open space than anywhere else in the city, maybe we should, why are we keep hitting that part of town for increasing our environmental protection, our environmental overlay zones?
Thank you. There's a few hands online, so I'm going to go there. Bob and then Benton. Go ahead, Bob.
Thanks. I guess what I just wanted to flag here, something I brought up at the last meeting is these discount rates, where, as you noted, if you have a certain amount of P zone or E zone, the site is downgraded in terms of its development potential. I think we do need to look closely at that. Those have been in place for a long time. I understand the methodology. I think the methodology is flawed, but that has a big impact on the decisions we make as to evaluating how much impact it does have to protect land. So I just want to revisit that at some point in this process. I don't think those assumptions should be taken as sacrosanct.
Thanks, Bob. Duly noted. Benton.
Thanks, Bob. I feel like I'm coming at this similarly, but maybe for a different reason. I'm curious in going through the documents and listening to the presentation about how in the BLI we determine land that's or parcels that are economically feasible to redevelop or add new buildings, and specifically based on current market conditions, just given the shifting conditions of the market, sort of how we acknowledge or plan for that. And then kind of relatedly, how does the implementation of an E-zone on a particular parcel impact the type of uses and then therefore the actual market value of that parcel? So say, like if you put something related to a wetland, for example, it may prevent a river dependent user from using that parcel. So it limits who could develop there. And so I'm sort of wondering the impact of that and how we consider it in this process.
I think for your first question, in terms of economic conditions, I think as Sam explained last time, we are using, I would say, more generous assumptions about the economics than current economic conditions in terms of interest rates and developer returns, sort of because this is a 25-year plan, we're not always going to be mired with what we have right now, 8% interest rates, or and so we have been less stringent than what you could actually go out and do today. You raise an interesting question about how and sort of where the E-zone is applied, how does that impact the use? In terms of, and I think this particularly applies to, say, if you have an isolated wetland in the middle of a site, how does that affect development feasibility and what you can do with it versus, say, along the slough, what might be the back edge of the site versus the Willamette River, where it could be an active, edge of the site and it's not necessarily the backside. And I don't, when it comes to E-zones, we haven't been as sensitive as to the location of the E-zone itself. I think Daniel said a good thing, this is a more generalized model that gets applied over how many industrial tax lots. It's hard to pick those individual site assessments to and then compile them back up. So we haven't really said, oh, that parcel has this wetland in the middle of it, that wipes the whole parcel out. We just don't have the ability to pick those isolated cases out. I do think when we talk about the North Reach and the Willamette River and the Greenway impacts, we can get more into what you're talking about as to, how does the Greenway or the river environmental zone affect the usability, or who can use those riverfront parcels?
I believe the river overlay, Jeff is more conversant with it than I am, but I believe that a lot of the environmental regulations don't apply on industrial river dependent uses. A lot of those river dependent uses are not applicable in the River E. Is that right, Jeff?
That's right. In the current zoning, so the Greenway overlay zone, which applies to the North Reach still, that's one piece that we would be expecting to update to the new, more consistent with what we apply elsewhere on the Willamette River. There's more allowances for river industrial, and there is clearly an emphasis put on river-dependent, river-related uses throughout almost all of the North Reach at this point.
In terms of like river-dependent industrial that's within the project area that we're talking about, there's only one site really that's there, and that's Terminal 6. And so Terminal 6 is mostly built out. There is a little bit of vacant land near the river, but the way we're applying E-zones on that Columbia River frontage, we're only applying C-zone anywhere along the Columbia. So we wouldn't be applying that P-zone to riparian wetlands that are around the Columbia River, where it could potentially restrict the development of Terminal 6.
So it's not as big of an issue in this particular project area. It will be more of an issue as it relates to the North Reach and the Greenway overlay. So that's very important to understand.
But the first part of his question about like trying to look at the geometry of these sites and how the E-zones are affecting the potential uses and do they carve them up, I think that's something that we'll hopefully get into in our site analysis, which is coming up shortly, because I think some of these sites could be, it's an interesting look at the actual layout and what the real world impacts are.
Thank you. One more hand online. Marie, do you have a question or clarification?
Thanks. I just feel like I want to put this whole question of land use and environmental resources in context. As Daniel said, all of Portland had natural resources before it was developed, and development happened, where it made the most sense and was the easiest to manage. So in some places, piping the streams was relatively easy. In some places it wasn't. Portland's industrial land and environmental conundrum is one that's shared nationally and probably internationally. So industrial land wants to be usually near water transport, wants to be in flat areas where it's easy to serve by rail, often is on filled wetlands, filled floodplains, and so on. Sometimes, like even South Waterfront, parts of South Waterfront were part of the river until fill occurred. So we have inherited a situation where under current thoughts on natural resources, we wouldn't have developed in those areas, but at the time, 100 years ago, those lands were seen as wastelands that could be better put to use for industrial development. So that's a situation where we're in, where it creates an inherent tension between industrial lands and natural resources. And so I just want to acknowledge that is why this area is different, and that just applying a percentage of like, oh, this area should only have this percentage of natural resource protection because that's fair, because that's what we do elsewhere in the city, doesn't really recognize the fact that this area is very flat, has very high water tables, that we're using our channels for part of our drainage system and stormwater management system like we do in Southwest and in the Johnson Creek, parts of Johnson Creek watershed. So there's certain context here that I think puts us in this situation. So I'm not arguing one level of protection or another, but I just want to make sure that we're acknowledging that there are particular conditions in this area that put us in this situation where we have this conversation every time we talk about industrial land. So anyway, thanks for let me just share that.
Well said. Thank you. Willie, yeah.
Yeah, Willie Myers with Columbia Pacific Building Trades. I have a quick question. So how does this apply to utilities and for like transmission as well as building like a converter station for electric and other? So
That's a good point. So we have specific standards that apply within the E-zones for things like utilities and roads that that exclude them from the, so we have general development standards, and that's what really the P-zone impacts, and you can't do things with, under the general development standards. But for utilities, linear utilities especially, there are specific standards that apply and allow those things to go through the protections that are required. Typically, they would still be subject to environmental review, so there would be a higher level discretionary review process. You'd have to go through and meet specific criteria of approval within the environmental review process. So you wouldn't, there's no way that you just go in and get a permit for it. But usually these are large scale planning processes that take a long time anyways. So, you know, it seems like that's an appropriate time for discretionary review. And there are ways to do utilities. So, so private development, no, but utilities, yes.
all right, thank you.
Yes.
I have a question going back to sort of the basis of the NRI itself. How does the high, medium, low designated resources sync up with what Metro designated? High, medium, low. Are they the same or are they greater or?
Very similar. We based our methodology on Metro's methodology. So they created their regional growth management functional plan in Title 13. Very shortly after that, Portland created our NRI, and we started with their methodology as a basis, but we made some tweaks. So we recognize the importance of wetlands and water features at a higher level than they do. It's kind of inside baseball. It gets really complicated trying to talk about the differences. But in general, I think our high designation is a little bit broader than their high designation. It encompasses a little bit more area. But it's very similar in how we're calculating those methodologies. Another thing that we use, so when they're calculating their values over a broad regional scale, we're city scale, so we're, you know, a third or a quarter of the area that's in Metro is in Portland. So we use our natural resource inventory. We're actually looking at the stream banks. We recognize that the slough is in many places 20, 30, 40, 50 feet wide, and that it's not just a linear little stripe on a map. So when they're calculating the riparian values, they use a point and they have a buffer around that point of X number of feet. We look at the stream channel, the slough channel, and we say the slough channel is 50 feet. We're buffering that same 50 feet, but it's starting at the slough channel and going out. So we tend to encompass more area because we recognize that these features are not just a linear line.
Yeah, and I guess I would just offer, you know, from my past history at the port, the devil is in the details, and you do have to look at the sites because it can render a site undevelopable depending upon where the particular resource is and how you categorize it and what's required associated with it. So I think it's very good that you're going to be doing some detailed mapping or evaluation. Or if you're not, I hope you are.
That's a perfect setup. What we're going to do after the break. One more question from Courtney, and then we'll take
Because the same thing, had the same question, which is the low to medium high NRA rankings are somewhat subjective, you know, and they're ranked differently here in Portland than compared to maybe Omaha, I don't know, whatever, you know. It would, and that's I think that's the fundamental, that's the starting point. You know, what's our ranking? And then how much do we personally value that here in the city? And then what do we want to do about it? You know, everything starts with that NRA ranking. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, that's true.
And so it might be useful, definitely be useful to me to get a better understanding of how we do that ranking here versus how they do it at Metro versus how the state looks at it versus how on average in the country they might do that ranking to see kind of where we sit with that. Is there some way to give us a sense of how we apply NRI rankings compared to the country at large?
That's a good point, and that's something that we should definitely include. I have not done that analysis personally, and I don't think that was included in any of the documentation that I've seen for the NRI, which was,
Yeah, I haven't, that's
which
what
was done before I got here. But I think that that's something we should look at, and I think that we should probably, when we produce our project report and as we move forward with considering these scenarios, we should include a consideration of other jurisdictions and how they document. I think that's a really good point.
Is it fair to say that if you look at these maps, which is an exercise we're going to do soon, these maps pick individual sites to be able to more concretely understand how these designations will affect a given site? So Dana was just thinking about, are any of these sites, I would imagine there's representation of like, here's a high resource and medium resource, so like different combinations we can see in practice how it's affecting an individual site as a way of understanding how it might, affect more broadly. And I don't know if some of these examples also might have an instance where the resource is like in the middle of the site and how that might affect versus on, kind of the edge of the site. So I think that's the value of, I think we tried to pick an assortment that offered like a lot of different situations. The value of this exercise is to be able to kind of, using specific examples, think about how those more broad assumptions could play out. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Maybe just before we break, Daniel, will you just quickly explain the three different map views that we have? And for those people online, after the break, we'll jump on and share these maps with those online as well.
Yeah, let me stand up here and point out what we're looking at. So each of these maps, there's 5 of them, 5 different sites. So we have, the biggest of them is the overlays the 3 scenarios on top of each other. There's a key that kind of shows you, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see how the buffers are growing and shrinking in the different scenarios. So the smallest area is always going to be that minimum compliance scenario. Protection zone is always going to be in orange. We have different shades of orange. So minimum compliance, moving on a little bit is that climate resilient scenario, and then the maximum is the greatest extent of that protection zone. Then we also have 3 shades of blue that are showing where the conservation zone is extending. So you can see how the different scenarios vary based on that color, and the keys will clue you in as you get a little bit closer, so you can see. But we have this, which is our 3 scenarios compared to the existing E-zones. So you can see what it looks like today on the ground with our current E-zones, what we're proposing. And this down here shows you the full natural resource inventory. It shows you the riparian resource rankings. Overlaid on top of that are our mapped wetlands, our mapped floodplains. There's a lot going on. This one kind of really clues you into it right here. You can see this is low ranking, medium ranking, high ranking. Those are the 3 riparian resource values all kind of laid out there on the site. And so you can kind of look at how are the E-zones being applied to those different riparian resource values. And so we'll have an opportunity to break into smaller groups and kind of look at these and dig into it. The statistical information that we have on here is what's happening with the BLI when we change the E-zone mapping. So you got the existing E-zones compared to the total site area, and then how is that calculated BLI area changing for each of these sites as we apply the different scenarios.
Is the bridge there? No.
This one here, this is North Vancouver Avenue. So this is Columbia Boulevard running through here, and then Vancouver right there.
So let's take a 5-minute break, 11:25. Those of you online, Tom's going to give you a better view of the maps and walk you through those. Daniel's going to help out with one discussion group, and I think, Jeff, you're helping out with another one. So take a 5-minute break, 10:25. Those in the room sort of find Daniel or Jeff, and they're going to walk us through a little discussion, and then we'll come back together and have more discussion. All right, 10:25. 11:25, sorry. Yeah, we're going some time. Anticipated daylight.
Still don't think it's pretty good.
Susie, just want to give you my card. Call me up, take you to lunch.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to do that.
Fun to see what you've been up to.
Okay, sorry. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're gonna dash. I have to be back at the
Okay, hello, everybody. I'm gonna share my screen. I would email these maps to you, but the file size is quite large. So we'll post these maps to the website after the meeting, probably on Monday. So you can go back and look at them, but let me share my screen. What are you seeing? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to zoom in here. So this first site is on North Columbia Boulevard. I think it's a site that we looked at previously. And so what Daniel was describing before the break is up here to the left, we have the existing E-zones and how they apply to the site. And on the right, we have the 3 E-zone scenarios as they build out. They overlap each other. It's a little bit hard to see. And then down here in the corner, the left-hand corner is the actual features. Whoop, I went too many pages down when I jumped down there. Let me go back up here. Yeah. So this map here in the lower left corner is where the actual natural resource features are and what type of features they are. And then we have a little bit of statistics about how the different E-zone scenarios apply. What you're seeing here and sort of the big difference, let me zoom in here again, on this site is that with the existing E-zones, as you see here on the left, and the difference between that and over here on the right, mainly has to do along this edge here, and this expanded C-zone, which is mainly due to the floodplain, which is this area down here on the lower left, and how that 170-foot buffer begins to apply to these sites up here. And why you don't see that apply over on this site to the right is we suspect, especially given the feature mapping, is that there's already been some fill that has taken place here that has raised this portion of the site outside of the floodplain, and therefore the E-zone, C-zone would not extend further down on that site. So this is one where there's a pretty narrow difference between the scenarios. I think as Daniel was explaining, it has to do with more, especially the resource area along the slough. It has more to do with that change between the P zone and the C zone. But this is how it shows the interaction between the riparian area along the slough and the floodplain. I think yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Thanks. I think it's just important because I think, and maybe folks do get this, but I just want to make sure that, when we talk about the theme of floodplains and the floodplain protections, it's easy to look at the map and say, well, gee, half the site's gone or a third of the site's gone. It's not. It doesn't require you to not develop there. It requires you to mitigate when you do develop. So you're going to have to do balance, cut, and fill. You're going to have to improve, certain things about natural resource features. But it doesn't prevent development. I think that's really important because it
Yes.
starts to look like the maps being, eliminated essentially when it's not.
Yeah, I think you are correct, Bob, that especially these blue areas on the map that are the C zone, that under the regulations, you're allowed to disturb or develop half of the area in the C zone with mitigation. And that, and again, what Daniel was explaining, the significant difference between the P zone and the C zone is that ability to develop and mitigate is a key feature. This second site here, and let me see. Is I think you can see here, this is a site that is connected to the slough. You see the slough down here in the lower left corner. But it is this parcel that hasn't been developed so far. It's connected to the slough. It looks like it has a lot of trees and vegetation on it. And so this shows under the scenarios how that layering effect expanding outward between the different scenarios begins to, it looks like, capture some of the resource values here in this lower left corner that it looks like this little finger here probably has some water feature, some drainage feature, and that's where you see the P zone getting applied down here in this lower part. And then, as we get into sort of that climate resilience or even the maximum, the climate resilient would buffer that drainage feature a little bit more. And so you see this medium color blue stretch out more as that contiguous vegetation. And then in the maximum protection scenario, you begin to capture more of this tree grove here that and sort of, as we talked about further, I'm not sure if the information is on here. My guess is, given this location, it's probably more of that IG zoning. And so this is where the difference would be between protecting this tree grove through the environmental overlay zone or versus just what the tree code preservation requirements would be. But as Bob was just saying, is that even sort of in this climate resilient scenario, this blue area could still be subject to disturbance. My guess is that one of these adjacent properties owns that parcel, and so it could be a future expansion with some mitigation, within that within the other resource areas on the site.
Asking, are there other
Yeah.
constraints on the site? It seems odd to have such a large site that hasn't been developed.
There could be other constraints.
Like they're in here. Identified non-E-zone constraints.
So the information down here, it looks like part of it is, and I'm guessing that it's probably, there's some steeper slopes down here that would put it in the landslide hazard, and the environmental cleanup site means that part of it shows up, or maybe it's tagged with an adjacent property owner that it's a brownfield site that requires environmental cleanup. But my guess is, given that it doesn't have street frontage, is that it's probably owned by one of these adjacent properties. And that therefore it was always, it might even be this property to the north that it's always been that sort of backyard area. Whatever business is there hasn't really had a need for it yet. And therefore it's still there, and that's why you probably have the more mature tree cover to it. This next feature, again on North Columbia Boulevard. Again, you see here on the left. So maybe we'll start down here in the lower with the NRI and the water features. You begin to see the buffer zone along the slough. What is this light green? Can you get in there? Wrong way. So it looks like it's low value resources. It's probably related, I would think, to the floodplain again. And then you have some medium value resources that are disturbed, and this is what Daniel was getting at, is that there may be some existing disturbance, and this is where the sort of buffer from the edge of the quality resource comes in. And so if someone were to come in and redevelop this site into something else, we would want them to pull that development back. This could become a mitigation area along this edge, and be able to sort of restore some of those values, given them that they're as a buffer zone in proximity to the slough. You can see here, this is where the current E-zones are applied. And so this is a case where there truly is a map correction process going on, that this crosshatch area that bubbles out currently applies to the site. And then if we slide over, you can see how that E-zone gets pulled much tighter along the edge of the slough in this kind of scenario. And again, it looks like there's some lower value resources down here in the corner. There's a little bit of a remnant vegetation that gets captured as well. And so this is an example of again, where we've gone back through with better mapping. With a site visit, we have a more accurate location on where those resources are. Yeah, Bob. Oh. Bob, did you have a question or something about this site? Or was that your hand up from before?
Sorry, just trying to find the microphone here.
Yeah.
It moved. I rearranged my screen and it's down at the bottom. Okay. No, I did not. That was an old hand. I apologize.
Okay. So again, and something that you can go back and look at. I mean, this shows sort of the relatively small changes that might happen on this site. And I think that's another point that Daniel didn't make, is that unlike that previous one, the changes we're talking about tend to be slivers of sites, and doing those adjustments as opposed to, wholesale impacts to the sites. And that's what we were trying to get at in terms of the number of lots that are impacted by this 33% or more coverage by some sort of E-zone. That those are the ones that are going to have significant impacts to them. And that's why we featured that analysis. Just moving on again, this site, I'm not quite sure. I'm guessing that this is somewhere in sort of the eastern end of the Columbia corridor. It looks like from the development pattern. Again, it's
it looks like it's a vacant lot that's been left over. It's got a lot of trees on it. The slough is running along the north edge here. And you can see from this map, in this, how these features are, again, sort of lower value features. It's sort of based on the proximity or distance from the slough. And that's how that plays out in these two different scenarios, that the main impact to this area is as we get sort of into that climate resilience or that maximum protection. You know, the climate resilience is going to have a bigger buffer from that slough edge here. And yet the maximum protection scenario is going to go in and really try to protect all of this tree grove that is contiguous to the slough, that really provides sort of that more significant riparian habitat. Again, still a relatively small site, but you begin to see that you know, what was 1.3 acres of buildable land essentially gets cut in half. You know, with the application of this C zone to the tree grove, in terms of our calculation. The way that plays out in terms of a development scenario is my guess is you would probably see them develop this corner lot pretty intensively and do the mitigation within the tree grove and the riparian buffer along this north edge. And then the last site we have is called the Fazio site. It's in North Portland. It's just east of MLK Boulevard. It's a remnant farm site that has some slough drainage areas running through it. But my guess is because of the floodplain and the low area, we have a lot of low and medium resources on that site. The wetlands and the higher value resources are these drainage ditches itself. And you can see how that's how we've applied the E-zones today. And then what you see here is sort of it looks like this is another case where you see what is C zones along the ditches today going to P zones. So the sort of no build area going up, and then you see, as the scenarios develop, a little bit wider buffer area along those drainage ditches, and that sort of begins to squeeze and limit the development along those properties. I think, again, also what you see here, and this was a case of what, just want to check this. So over here, this site, this edge of the site here, this being the P zone on this site for some reason, and that staying a P zone under this scheme, and that being mainly from what Daniel was explaining about Metro, about not reducing the protections on existing resources. So that might be a case of what we're looking at over here to the right. Those are sort of the 5 different cases we have. We can go back and look at any of them if people have specific questions or want to understand more about how the different scenarios apply the different protection measures. to these sites. Have I totally confused you all with this online presentation? Okay. And again, we'll make these maps available. Also, we did send out in the agenda a link to the online mapping tool. And so you can use that and I think we'll do that after the break, just to show that you can use that to zoom in to your favorite site to see what's going on. And that has both the natural resource inventory information as well as the E-zone scenario information itself.
Tom, can you go back to the what site before this one?
Yeah. This one?
Yeah. So in this scenario on the right here, you mentioned that you would think that they would develop this corner pretty heavily and then do the mitigation.
Yeah,
What
that would be
Go ahead.
if they owned both sites, yes.
So they'd have to own both parcels, right? But if
Yeah.
Okay.
If they owned, if the parcels were in different ownership, then under this scenario, someone could come in and basically disturb half of their E-zone area, and then do some sort of mitigation on what was left of the undisturbed area. And then a different entity could come in and basically would probably develop the front half of this, and be able to develop half of the C zone with some mitigation. Or if it was owned by this building next door, they would be able to expand their building, and disturb a total of half of the C zone area and then do additional mitigation. I forget exactly how much of that mitigation has to be on site versus what the off-site mitigation options are. So I believe there is some flexibility and ability to mitigate off-site.
So I'm just curious. So I appreciate that. I'm just curious about, I mean, I think this goes back to my earlier question. I'm curious about once this parameter happens on a site of this nature, particularly if you're just one owner, not the building. The building next door, I think that makes sense. If they were to own these parcels, using them more broadly makes sense. But if you're just one owner, what is the actual final square footage of developable land here that you could put something on, and is it viable for the type of industrial development that happens today?
And we can go back and look a little bit more and do some calculations about, and again, what you're seeing here, this protecting this tree grove is under that maximum protection. But we could take this example and do more of a site-specific development scenarios, like, okay, you could get this much coverage, and it's likely to be this big a building under the climate resilience scenario, and under the maximum protection scenario, it would be this. But we could play out those two different site development scenarios and provide that information.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to just have an understanding of like what are the actual practical scenarios of the use of these plots.
Yeah. Bob?
Yeah, this has been super helpful to see actual sites, because I think we get stuck in kind of a theoretical universe. And it takes me back, at the risk of thinking out loud too much, to the river planning process where we spent a decade, Susie, I'm sure remembers this all too well too, trying to come up with, zoning approaches basically to protecting natural resources, which, is the default position. But at the end of that, after it all failed, I also wondered a little bit about the fact that you have a limited geography and a limited number of sites. But to some degree, it almost lends itself to kind of a mini master planning kind of approach as well. You don't have that many sites that you're really worried about, especially the big ones. And how do you zoning can be a blunt tool, but I think about like this site versus the one that you showed earlier that was just completely not a bit of vegetation on it. Those are very different scenarios. And so again, at the risk of thinking out loud, it just makes me wonder sometimes about, how you get at what's the optimal on this site. You have two parcels side by side. Do they have the same owner? Where are the most important natural resources? When I look at this, I think, well, the ones that are closest to the slough, if I had to make a choice, I want the trees that are closest to the slough. And I want to get as many of those as I can. So as wide as I can there. I want the whole thing, obviously, from a natural resource perspective, but when you start to get into the zoning, you start to go, well, you can have half of this side and half of that side, and you can arrange it this way. That doesn't necessarily optimize things for anybody at the end of the day. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think it's something to think about on some of these sites. Am I making any sense?
A little bit.
A little bit. That's better than
Yeah.
usual.
I mean, I think one of the things that we could go back through, as you were saying, with say, like an example like this, is that we could break down that impact by lot size, and to show sort of how that gets distributed in terms of, and I think that's what we've tried to do with the 33% cutoff, and we could do some sensitivity testing on, like, if you move that line to 50%, or if you move that line to 25%, how does that sort of impact the development capacity? But also looking at, hey, this one is probably, I would guess, maybe up to a 10-acre site, maybe a little bit larger, versus that 2 or 3 acre site we were looking at so this site area is 5 acres for these two parcels. If I read the map, they provide that information for me. But we could break down, just similar to what we talked about at last meeting and the buildable land inventory and those site sizes. Like, what is the impact happening on those 3 to 5 acre sites versus the 5 to 10 acre sites versus the 10+ acre sites? And if we show, I think maybe this is what Benton was getting at, is if we show, hey, our larger sites have a lower impact, they're able to, they have room to play, and they have room to accommodate, like in this example, the margins along the slough. You can work with that. That's why I think you see across the board, at least in terms of the buildable land inventory, we show very little difference in the impact on the buildable nature of this parcel, because this expanded slough just impacts a smaller portion of the site. You still have room to build a bigger building, to have the trucking maneuver areas and the parking areas without having to encroach in the slough. And so we could go back and do that sort of tax lot size analysis to show who's getting impacted at what level.
Yeah, but I think I'm saying something different though, Tom. I don't want to belabor this, but it goes back to the purple green map, and somewhere Sally Edmonds' head is exploding as I say that. But but seriously, where, again, this is a blunt tool, right? So you wind up going, well, there's a whole bunch of hatch marks across this fence of the property, then you have to protect X amount. That doesn't necessarily get you to the most optimal development scenario or the most optimal natural resource perspective. And so I'm just making stuff up here, but on a site like this, is there a way to potentially say, well, kind of let's make a deal? What we really want is a wider buffer on the slough. We'd rather have another 10 or 15 feet of buffer that's planted than a whole bunch of hatch marks on a parking lot kind of a thing per se.
Right.
And, and the different sites lend themselves to different things. Different sites, there's some sites that will get captured that probably will never have a lot of resource value, but they'll still be encumbered. And then there are other sites that have a lot of resource value, but we're not necessarily capture that in the most optimal way. And that's why I started saying, is there a way to do kind of mini master planning on at least some of the big sites where you can say, this is really what we're after. Does this work for you as a property owner? Rather than all this other stuff, if you had to do X, Y, and Z, and then your property's unencumbered beyond that, does that work, or what would work for you? And that was the purple green approach of looking at individual parcels during the river planning process and saying, well, this one has a creek running through it. Do we get to that as opposed to some of these other things that don't add up to anything necessarily? Does that make sense that now, more?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I think we could get at that two ways. One is sort of in a general methodology that's a bias towards the C zone, right? Maybe having slightly wider C zones that offer a little bit more protection, but give a little bit more flexibility to the landowner or developer. And then also as you were suggesting, like if we have some prime larger sites that it's developed, but say take for example Portland Meadows, and to be able as part of this site sort of work with the property owners, work with you or the Columbia Slough Watershed Council, and really get in there and have a pre-development, pre-application discussion about, well, what really makes sense, and to that's a very labor intensive process, but to be able to do that for the largest, most important sites, we could explore how we would pull that off. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, but C zones don't get me there, and I'll stop talking now because I think it's a bigger discussion. I don't want to dominate here, but C zones don't get me there because C zones, the flexibility tends to work against the environment. Frankly, it tends to be kind of what do you want to do, and then what's left over. And so what I'm trying to get at is certainty on both sides, and that was what Purple Green gave us, was kind of pre-agreements on stuff. This is what makes sense on this property. Can you do it? Can you do a portion of it? So I'm looking for certainty on both sides, and that was the goal of Purple Green, was to give both sides assurances that this is what you're getting, this is what you're losing. Can you agree to that? But I don't want to get roped into a world of, well, let's create as much flexibility as possible necessarily, because the flexibility in a development scenario doesn't benefit the environment typically. Thanks, though.
I understand what you're getting at now, and we can go back and look at and see if we can come up with, how many large sites do we have? Could we go sit down on those large sites and cut a deal, essentially, is what you're saying, like we did in the North Reach Purple Green map?
Yes.
Yeah, Kara.
Yeah, I think as we're looking at these and digging further into what development could occur on the sites, kind of like Benton suggested, I think it's also important to remember that there's other setbacks and on the sites that are required. So even if you go from total of 3 acres and then only 1.5 is developable, really with the other setbacks, it could be significantly less, and then coverage requirements as well. So you can only build so much. So you might end up with a 3-acre site that gets whittled down to allowing 10,000 square feet of development, which nobody will build, right? So that doesn't get you jobs. So it's another component of it. So understanding when we're looking at through a development lens, understanding the other requirements of development that will be relevant to that site.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying in terms of how that all plays out. Marie?
Hi, thanks. I'm hesitant to jump in because I'm technically not part of the working
Yeah.
group. I'm an observer. But I do think this question about size of site and impact seems important since in Steve's presentation, he identified that the projected shortfall in industrial land is in the larger sites. So understanding that relationship seems important. And I wanted to build on what Bob, and actually I think Carol was also speaking to, is like this. I know the EOA is not the process where we do individual site planning, but I want to acknowledge that there are a number of constraints, including transportation and utility constraints on some of these sites. And in an ideal world, I think that the EOA would be accompanied by an industrial land strategy that did some site assessments for our larger, more optimal sites and looked at what the range of constraints were, and then worked between the city and the property owners to figure out how, if and how those constraints could be addressed for mutual benefit. So I know that that's not the same as e-zoning, but I just wanted to, put this conversation in that context, just again, building on what Bob had already said.
Yeah, and it just so happens that we just secured a grant from Metro to do exactly that, to do an industrial land readiness study, to be able to look at all of those constraints, and how they interact, and sort of what investments could happen, especially on the infrastructure side, to help relieve some of those constraints. And what Bob is saying is, like, given the timing of that and the timing of the e-zone mapping projects, there may be an opportunity to sync up some of this work, and to be able to fold it in with that e-zone decision. Anything else? Otherwise, I think we are pretty close to reassembling here and sharing out what we saw on the maps and what we found. I am going to close out or mute myself and get the room computer back on so that you all are on the big screen and your comments are coming back through the speaker in the room so everyone can hear. So we'll reconvene in just a few minutes.
8 years. Great, hi. Thank you all for coming back. So we're gonna go till 12:30. We have about 20 minutes just to do a bit of a download on the conversations, questions, ideas, comments, concerns. Anyone want to share an observation? Anyone have an aha moment? One way or the other? Silence. There was a lot of talking.
Did people think it was helpful to see real live examples and see how these different scenarios play out in different examples?
Yes. Thumbs up. Excellent. Nodding heads. Good.
I think, for the folks that were online, the discussion, one of the things that we sort of started to talk about is there a way to go back and look at especially the larger sites that are part of the buildable land inventory and look at those specifically, maybe even do custom mapping, with the property owner, with developers, with the natural resource community to be able to say, this is really important here. Can we put the line here and maybe not so much there and almost do custom mapping, which is sort of what was done in the North Reach Plan back in 2010. And maybe looking at those larger sites where there is more impact on the environment, there is more impact on development, that if we looked at those, that might be an opportunity as well to really fine tune how these zones apply.
And Tom, if you could put some numbers to the costs, because I think that's a factor, what does that mean in terms of mitigation costs? Because it just makes it clear. I think the other thing that was very interesting are the other constraints. And as everyone pointed out, it's going to be even more intense in the North Reach. But there are, there's the Superfund, there's just a whole series of things that impact those sites. And so I do think that would be a great idea.
Yeah, and just to that end, we did get, Steve wrote up and we were successful with Metro in getting a grant to do an industrial land readiness project to look at some of those larger sites and some of those areas that particularly focused on infrastructure constraints and sort of what kind of investments could the city do to at least sort of relieve those constraints. And so there may be this large site in E-zone and industrial land readiness, depending on the timing of everything, there may be a way to sort of bring that all together.
And was it clear to you all about how all these things overlay as you were looking at the different sites? Any questions?
Much better. Yeah, it was a big education. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
You're saying is clear all the differences of different types of, oh yeah, easy.
Well, right, that part's not clear, but at least like you can kind of see how it lays out on a few sites.
And we will post these maps to the website for this meeting, so you'll be able to find them and study them more or share them with your family and friends to have deeper conversations.
One thing that did pop up is I wouldn't mind a little more clarity on the transition zone.
Yeah.
Exactly, what does that mean? What does it not mean? Yeah.
Let me jump up on the board here and diagram this because it's complicated.
Yeah.
So there's a graphic in the memo that we shared that you can see this in. It's also in our zoning code. But if you have an environmental overlay zone, let's say this is the site right here. And let's say there's an environmental overlay zone cutting through part of the site here. And let's say it's two different zones. Let's say this part is conservation zone and this part is protection zone. This is the outer edge of the E zone. There's a line It's about 25, is exactly 25 feet in from the edge of the E zone, follows along the edge, and it applies whether it's the conservation zone or the protection zone. It's always 25 feet. It's defined as the outer 25 feet of any E zone, which is known as the transition area. Real teeth, the meat of the E zone, how they apply, is that they have mandatory setbacks from water features and they have limits on the creation of new disturbance area. Those rules and regulations do not apply in this 25-foot transition area. So basically, that's a freebie zone. The only thing that applies in here is if you cut down a tree, you have to replace that tree. You have to mitigate somewhere else on the site or somewhere else in the zone. So when you look at these E zones and these maps up here, we didn't draw it in here, but anytime you're looking at the E zone, the outer edge right here is transition area, and there's really no rules and regulations that apply there. No real restrictions. So, so it's complicated, but that means that like if that E zone is going onto the edge of your building or something like that, there may not really be restrictions in terms of expanding your building. This is really the long and the short of why that's important.
For clarification, Steve, you have a question on your face.
What's the regulatory function of it if there are no regulatory requirements that apply there?
If there happen to be trees in that area, those
In the E zone.
U or C, either one. It's the transition area applies to both the P and the C cells. So either one, it's the outer edge. If there happen to be any trees in there and you need to cut those down to facilitate site development, you have to mitigate impacts. So that's the only, it's the real, because a lot of times we know that E zones are bleeding onto the developed portions of sites where there really aren't any resources. This is serving as a buffer. So when that transition area falls on a developed site, nothing applies there. So you can expand your development and do whatever you want without restriction. But when that transition area falls on an undeveloped site that has a lot of forest vegetation, then that's when it still helps because you're getting mitigation.
Yes, Bob, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure, so when you say the outer 25 feet, so if you have a 25-foot P zone, it's the next 25 feet. It's not the, and if you have a 50-foot, it's the 75, right?
If you,
on that, where is the transition zone? If you have, how does that work if you have a 50-foot P zone?
It's on the inside of the line. So what was done we go back to the airport futures plan. What was done was that, and we're not currently proposing to do this, but what was done in the airport futures plan was they said there's a stream here. And we're gonna put a 50-foot protection zone around that stream. So they went out 50 feet. And they said, this is gonna be P zone out to 50 feet. And then they said, we're gonna add on another 25 feet of conservation zone around the outside. So this was C and this was P. And this part was the transition area here. And this was the protection. So you got a real 50-foot setback from all water features because they said 50-foot plus 25 feet, 75 feet, you get to ignore this outer 25 feet there. We're not currently proposing to do that. So in our maximum resource protection scenario, when we say 50 feet, we mean 50 feet, which means that you put a 50-foot protection zone around a water feature, the outer 25 feet is really transition area. That really doesn't apply. However, in a lot of cases, there actually is some conservation zone out there because there's trees, there's other vegetation. That medium resource value area extends further. And in this case, when the conservation zone extends further, you really do get that 50-foot setback. So it depends on how much development there is on the site, how far that medium riparian value extends on that site. But sometimes when it's a developed site, that's very good.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for asking, Bob, because I was thinking just like you. It's like, okay, so this is compared to airport futures, we're going to go in the opposite direction unless it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Other questions? Reflections on scenarios?
I just want to give a compliment. I think it was a really useful meeting for me, and I think you were all well prepared, so. I'm not saying I've taken it all in, but I just want to give a compliment to everybody who pulled the meeting together today. And, you know, it's been a long journey to feeling like we're working the community and planning an industry together. And I think doing the breakouts today, it began to feel like we really were having those conversations. So, you know, long time coming, but it did feel like that today for the first time. So.
Thank you.
That's why there's so many BPS staff here, because it takes all these people to
get them all fit together.
And I think that's what we want to do next time, only focus on the North Reach area. And Jeff will be in the hot seat next.
Bob, I see your hand up. Is that from before, or do you have an additional comment?
So before.
Okay, thank you.
I guess if you are going to focus next time on the North Reach, can you make sure you have expertise in the room around the settlement, the NERDA settlement that just happened?
Yeah.
And its implications for all of them.
Yep.
Anything else for today? Really appreciate the discussion. We'll continue. Next meeting, remind me what the date is.
First.
December 1st, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And it'll probably be a similar setup to today, so if you can make it in person, all the better. Thank you all very much. Thank you online. Ruth, you head back.